Did the United States create ISIS? It's a question that has stirred up debates, theories, and countless opinions. Many argue that the rise of ISIS was no accident, and that the U.S., with its military actions in the Middle East, played a crucial role in shaping the conditions that allowed the group to thrive. But is that really the case? Or is it simply an oversimplified narrative? What if we told you that the story of ISIS's rise is far more complex than we've been led to believe? What if the very actions taken to combat terrorism ended up contributing to its spread? Today, we'll dive into this controversial topic, exploring both the direct and indirect consequences of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Now, stick with us till the end, because we'll reveal some shocking facts that might make you question everything you thought you knew about the U.S.'s role in the creation of ISIS. You won't want to miss this. To understand the question of whether the U.S. created ISIS, we first need to know what ISIS actually is. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIS, is a militant group that rose to global notoriety for its extreme violence and brutal tactics. But the story of ISIS isn't one that started overnight. It's rooted in the complex history of Iraq and the Middle East. ISIS didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's a product of a series of events, decisions, and power struggles that span decades. Its roots can be traced back to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when the United States, led by President George W. Bush, decided to take military action against Saddam Hussein's regime. The official reasons given for the invasion were the alleged presence of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and the desire to eliminate Saddam's oppressive rule. But once Saddam was overthrown, a massive power vacuum was left behind. And this power vacuum was the perfect breeding ground for extremist groups. At the time, Iraq was already deeply divided along sectarian lines. Shiite, Sunni, and Kurdish populations often found themselves at odds. When Saddam's regime fell, it was the Sunnis who lost their grip on power. The new government, backed by the U.S., was largely Shiite, and this created a sense of alienation and resentment among many Sunni Iraqis. Among them were former military officers, ex-Ba'ath Party members, and those who had been part of Saddam's regime. These individuals, desperate for stability and seeking revenge for their loss of power, formed alliances with extremist groups. One of those groups was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would eventually evolve into ISIS. In 2004, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, declared a war on the Shiite majority government and began targeting civilians. Zarqawi's brutal tactics gained him notoriety, but they also fueled further divisions in Iraqi society. Despite Zarqawi's death in 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq continued to grow, feeding on the anger and disillusionment of disenfranchised Sunnis. Fast forward to 2010, and ISIS, then still known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was rebranding itself under a new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. By now, the group had grown stronger, with thousands of fighters flocking to join its ranks. But it wasn't just the chaos of post-invasion Iraq that fueled ISIS's rise. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, gave ISIS an opportunity to expand its operations into Syria. The U.S. and other countries' involvement in Syria, including the push to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, created more instability and provided an opening for extremist groups like ISIS to thrive. So, how does this all tie back to the United States? The invasion of Iraq created a cascading effect, a series of unintended consequences that allowed ISIS to flourish. By dismantling Saddam Hussein's regime and alienating the Sunni population, the U.S. set the stage for radical groups to take hold. The disbanding of the Iraqi army, the lack of post-invasion planning, and the rise of sectarian violence all played into the hands of extremists. And while the U.S. was focused on fighting terrorism, it was inadvertently creating the conditions for a new form of terrorism to take root. But were the U.S. actions in Iraq the sole reason for ISIS's rise? Or were there other factors at play? We'll get into that as we continue to unpack the story of ISIS's creation. Stay tuned. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a turning point in the history of the Middle East. On paper, the goal was clear: to remove Saddam Hussein from power, eliminate weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and bring about a new era of democracy. But as we now know, the invasion had far-reaching consequences, not only for Iraq but for the entire region. And among those consequences was the creation of an environment ripe for the rise of groups like ISIS. When the U.S.-led coalition toppled Saddam Hussein's brutal regime, they did more than just remove a dictator. They dismantled the entire state apparatus. Saddam's security forces, military, and government institutions were wiped out almost overnight. This didn't just leave a power vacuum, it created chaos. And in a place where law and order were already fragile, chaos quickly turned into an all-out breakdown of society. The immediate aftermath of the invasion was marked by widespread violence. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, and millions of Iraqis found themselves without jobs or security. The sense of disillusionment was widespread, and the sectarian tensions between Iraq's Shiite and Sunni populations were brought to the forefront. Under Saddam's rule, the Sunni minority had held the most power, but now they were out of favor with the new Shiite-led government. The U.S., for its part, tried to install a new government, but the transition wasn't smooth. The political landscape was fractured, and the new leaders struggled to unite the country. With no jobs, no security, and no clear path to stability, many Iraqis felt abandoned. And into this void stepped the extremists. In the chaos of post-invasion Iraq, groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which would eventually evolve into ISIS, saw an opportunity. They capitalized on the growing anger and resentment among Sunni Iraqis who felt they had been left behind by the new government. These extremist groups promised to restore Sunni power, even if it meant resorting to violence. The group began recruiting members from disillusioned former military officers, Ba'ath Party loyalists, and young men who had no other means of survival. Perhaps the most significant impact of the invasion was the dismantling of Iraq's army. When the U.S. disbanded the military, they essentially stripped the country of its ability to maintain order. Thousands of experienced soldiers were left without jobs, and many turned to insurgency. Some of these former soldiers would later become key figures in ISIS. The disbanding of the army not only created a huge loss of manpower, but also a loss of military expertise. It gave groups like ISIS a ready-made pool of fighters, many of whom had first-hand knowledge of military strategy and tactics. Furthermore, the decision to bar former Ba'ath Party members from holding government positions also contributed to the growing instability. Many of those who had been part of Saddam Hussein's regime found themselves out of work and disenfranchised. The U.S.'s efforts to reshape Iraq's political landscape created a power struggle, and as the country slid further into chaos, the seeds of extremism began to take root. The U.S. invasion didn't just destabilize Iraq, it ignited a powder keg of anger and resentment. By creating a situation where extremist groups could thrive, the U.S. inadvertently contributed to the rise of ISIS. But was it just the invasion itself that caused this? Or were there other factors that played a role in creating the conditions for ISIS to emerge? We'll explore that in the next section. To understand the rise of ISIS and the U.S.'s indirect role in it, we need to take a step back and look at the long and complicated relationship between the U.S. and extremist groups in the Middle East, specifically Al-Qaeda. While ISIS is often viewed as a new threat, its origins can be traced back to the days of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, a group that rose to prominence in the aftermath of the 2003 invasion. The history of the U.S. and Al-Qaeda is long and tangled. Back in the 1980s, during the Soviet-Afghan War, the United States supported a range of Afghan resistance fighters who were fighting against the Soviet invasion. Among these fighters were members of what would later become Al-Qaeda. The U.S., fearing the expansion of Soviet influence, funneled money, weapons, and training to these mujahideen groups. At the time, Al-Qaeda wasn't even a known entity. It was just one faction among many. Fast forward to the 1990s, and Al-Qaeda had transformed into a global terrorist organization under the leadership of Osama bin Laden. It was during this time that the U.S. first became directly involved in combating Al-Qaeda, particularly after the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993 and later the devastating 9/11 attacks in 2001. In response, the U.S. launched the Global War on Terror, which included the invasion of Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda's stronghold. But here's where things get interesting. While the U.S. was focused on combating Al-Qaeda on one front, in Iraq, a similar group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, was taking shape. After the invasion of Iraq, the power vacuum created by Saddam Hussein's removal gave rise to AQI, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Al-Zarqawi was an early ally of Al-Qaeda, and it was his brutal methods of terrorism that drew the attention of the U.S. However, the U.S.'s response to AQI would set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead to the rise of ISIS. In the early days of the Iraq War, the U.S. was focused on combating AQI, seeing them as a direct threat to the newly formed Iraqi government and the stability of the region. But the way the U.S. chose to handle AQI, through military strikes, heavy-handed tactics, and the detention of suspected militants, created a cycle of violence that only fed into the narrative of jihadist groups. The U.S.'s response to AQI pushed many disillusioned Iraqis, especially Sunnis, into the arms of extremist groups. As the U.S. and its allies fought against AQI, the group grew more powerful and more entrenched. The U.S.'s tactics in Iraq, such as airstrikes and the destruction of cities, helped radicalize even more Iraqis. The brutal treatment of detainees in U.S.-run prisons, such as Abu Ghraib, only added fuel to the fire. For many, the U.S. was not seen as a liberator, but as an oppressor. This, in turn, made it easier for AQI to recruit new members and gain support. And then, when AQI was finally driven out of Iraq, it didn't disappear, it simply rebranded. In 2013, under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, AQI formally split from Al-Qaeda and became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. This shift marked the beginning of a new phase for the group, one that would see it grow in both power and territory. And despite the U.S.'s relentless efforts to combat these extremist groups, many argue that the conditions created by the U.S. invasion, the war on terror, and the handling of Al-Qaeda in Iraq were critical in shaping ISIS into the global threat it became. So, what role did the U.S.'s past interactions with Al-Qaeda play in the creation of ISIS? The U.S.'s support for rebel groups in the 1980s, its heavy-handed response to AQI in Iraq, and its broader military presence in the region all set the stage for the rise of ISIS. But was it just a case of bad decisions, or was it a deeper, more systemic issue? As we continue, we'll explore the theory that the U.S., by destabilizing the region and creating a power vacuum, might have indirectly helped pave the way for ISIS. Now that we've explored the U.S.'s involvement in the Middle East and its complicated relationship with extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, we need to address the controversial theory that the U.S. essentially created ISIS. The idea that the U.S. played a direct or indirect role in the formation of ISIS is a contentious one, but it's a theory that has gained traction over the years. The crux of this theory lies in the consequences of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. When the U.S. toppled Saddam Hussein's regime, it didn't just eliminate a dictator, it destabilized an entire country. Iraq's political and social structures were deeply shaken, and a power vacuum emerged. This vacuum didn't just affect the government. It opened the door for radical groups to step in and seize control. Without Saddam's authoritarian rule, the country was left vulnerable to chaos. One of the key factors in this theory is the dismantling of Iraq's military. When the U.S. disbanded Saddam Hussein's army, it not only removed a powerful institution, but also left thousands of trained soldiers without jobs or support. Many of these former soldiers, many of whom were Sunni, turned to insurgency. Some of these individuals would go on to form the backbone of ISIS. The theory argues that by disbanding the military without a clear plan for rebuilding, the U.S. created the conditions that allowed ISIS to recruit from this pool of disillusioned, disenfranchised Iraqis. But the U.S. didn't just create a power vacuum in Iraq. It also exacerbated the existing sectarian tensions. Saddam Hussein's rule had been harsh and oppressive, but it kept a fragile peace between Iraq's Sunni and Shiite populations. After the invasion, the Shiite majority government, backed by the U.S., began marginalizing the Sunnis, who had once held power under Saddam. This created a deep sense of resentment and anger among many Sunnis, making them more susceptible to extremist ideologies. ISIS, with its promise to restore Sunni dominance, was able to tap into these frustrations and recruit many of those who felt abandoned by the new government. The theory also suggests that the U.S.'s actions in Iraq and Syria played directly into the hands of ISIS's rise. The U.S.'s involvement in the Syrian civil war, particularly its support for opposition groups seeking to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, created further instability in the region. As the conflict in Syria escalated, ISIS capitalized on the chaos, seizing territory and expanding its influence. The U.S., despite its efforts to combat ISIS, was indirectly contributing to the very instability that allowed the group to thrive. Another point often raised by proponents of the creation theory is the argument that the U.S.'s war on terror, while aimed at fighting extremism, has often had the unintended effect of fueling it. The aggressive military tactics used by the U.S. in Iraq, such as airstrikes and raids, often resulted in civilian casualties, which further alienated local populations. The infamous torture scandals, like Abu Ghraib, serve as a powerful recruitment tool for groups like ISIS, who use the U.S.'s actions as propaganda to attract new fighters. So, did the U.S. create ISIS? While it's a bold statement, the theory is based on a series of interconnected events and decisions. The invasion of Iraq, the dismantling of the military, the marginalization of Sunnis, and the broader instability created by the U.S. in the Middle East all played a role in setting the stage for ISIS's rise. But it's important to remember that the story of ISIS is not just one of U.S. actions. Other regional and global players have also contributed to the crisis, and the situation in the Middle East is incredibly complex. Was the U.S. solely responsible? Or were there other factors at play that we need to consider? Let's take a look at the role of the international community and how multiple actors have shaped the rise of ISIS in the next section. While there is no doubt that U.S. actions in the Middle East contributed to the rise of ISIS, it's crucial to recognize that the U.S. has also been one of the key players in the fight to dismantle the group. The paradox here is striking. The very same country whose actions may have contributed to the creation of ISIS has also led the global coalition aimed at destroying it. This contradiction is at the heart of the ongoing debate about the U.S.'s role in the Middle East. In 2014, as ISIS surged across Iraq and Syria, declaring itself a caliphate and committing atrocities on a scale not seen since the height of Al-Qaeda's power, the U.S. realized it had to take decisive action. The world watched as ISIS captured major cities like Mosul and Raqqa, bringing the horrors of terrorism to the global stage. And while the U.S. had a significant hand in creating the conditions that allowed ISIS to thrive, it quickly became the primary force in leading an international coalition to defeat the group. The Obama administration, in response to the rising threat of ISIS, launched Operation Inherent Resolve in 2014. This mission aimed to eliminate ISIS's stronghold in Iraq and Syria, using a combination of airstrikes, ground operations, and intelligence efforts. The U.S.-led coalition, which included over 60 countries, worked together to contain and eventually push back ISIS forces. U.S. airstrikes, in particular, played a critical role in weakening ISIS's infrastructure, cutting off supply lines, and targeting key leaders within the group. In addition to the military campaign, the U.S. provided significant financial and military support to local forces fighting ISIS on the ground. This included backing Kurdish fighters in Syria, who played a major role in the battle for key ISIS-held cities like Kobani and Raqqa. The U.S. also supported the Iraqi military, helping to train and equip them to take back territory from ISIS. But despite these efforts, the fight against ISIS has not been without its challenges. For one, the U.S.'s involvement in the region is seen by many as a double-edged sword. While the U.S. has provided crucial support in defeating ISIS, its presence in the Middle East has also fueled resentment and anger among some locals. In many areas, especially in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. is viewed as an occupying force, and the military's actions sometimes exacerbate the very instability it seeks to mitigate. Another issue with the U.S.'s fight against ISIS has been the complex web of alliances and interests in the region. In Syria, for instance, the U.S. found itself fighting alongside the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, which were supported by the U.S., while also battling against the Syrian government, which was backed by Russia and Iran. The chaotic nature of these alliances made it difficult for the U.S. to focus solely on ISIS, as its actions were often tangled up in the broader geopolitical struggle for control of the region. Furthermore, the U.S.'s strategy to combat ISIS hasn't always been entirely successful. Despite the military victories and the eventual recapture of ISIS-held territories, the group has evolved. While it no longer controls large swaths of land, ISIS has gone underground, carrying out insurgencies and terrorist attacks in both Iraq and Syria, and has even inspired similar groups across the globe. So, while the U.S. has been a driving force in defeating ISIS militarily, its role is not without criticism. The paradox remains: the same country whose actions in the past helped create the conditions for ISIS's rise has also been a primary force in its destruction. The ongoing question is whether the U.S. can ever truly leave the Middle East without creating further instability, or if its involvement is a necessary evil in the fight against groups like ISIS. As we examine the U.S.'s role in the creation and defeat of ISIS, it's important to recognize that the rise of the group isn't solely the result of American actions. The Middle East is a region that has been shaped by centuries of political, ethnic, and religious tensions, and the situation is far more complicated than any one nation's involvement. The U.S., while playing a significant role, is only one player in a much larger geopolitical game. To understand the bigger picture, we need to take a step back and consider the broader dynamics at play in the region. The Middle East has long been a hotbed of conflict, driven by deep-rooted historical rivalries, sectarianism, and foreign intervention. The U.S.'s actions in Iraq and Syria were certainly significant, but they didn't occur in a vacuum. Other international powers, such as Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, have all played critical roles in shaping the outcomes we see today. One of the most important factors in the rise of ISIS is the long-standing sectarian divide between Sunni and Shiite Muslims. Under Saddam Hussein, Iraq was ruled by a Sunni minority, but after the 2003 invasion, the country's power structure shifted to a Shiite majority. This shift created a sense of alienation and anger among the Sunnis, who found themselves excluded from the new government and left to fend for themselves in a country that was rapidly falling into chaos. Groups like ISIS capitalized on this disenfranchisement, promising to restore Sunni power and to fight against what they saw as the Shiite-dominated government that the U.S. had helped install. In Syria, the situation was equally volatile. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, created the perfect environment for ISIS to spread its influence. The U.S., alongside other international actors, supported opposition groups seeking to overthrow Bashar al-Assad's regime. This support, while aimed at toppling a dictator, inadvertently created a power vacuum that allowed ISIS to gain a foothold in the region. As the U.S. and its allies focused on removing Assad, they inadvertently ignored the rise of ISIS, which used the chaos to establish its so-called caliphate. Meanwhile, other regional powers, such as Iran, were also pursuing their own interests in Iraq and Syria. Iran's support for the Shiite majority government in Iraq and its backing of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad helped to solidify their influence in the region. These actions created further divisions between Sunni and Shiite populations, making it easier for extremist groups like ISIS to gain support among Sunnis who felt oppressed by the Shiite-led governments. Russia, too, played a significant role in the region, particularly in Syria. While the U.S. focused on supporting opposition forces, Russia aligned itself with the Assad regime, providing military support and backing the Syrian government's crackdown on rebels. This foreign intervention, along with the U.S.'s own military presence, turned the Syrian civil war into a proxy battle for global influence, with the fate of the region hanging in the balance. The involvement of these regional and global powers highlights the complexity of the situation. The Middle East isn't simply a battleground between good and evil, with the U.S. and its allies on one side and ISIS on the other. Instead, it's a region where multiple actors, each with their own interests and agendas, have shaped the course of events. The rise of ISIS can't be attributed solely to the U.S. It's the product of a web of interconnected factors, including sectarian divisions, regional power struggles, and the broader global competition for influence. As we reflect on this, it's clear that there's no easy answer to the question of who created ISIS. While the U.S.'s actions certainly played a role, they're only part of the story. The situation in the Middle East is far more complex, with multiple actors contributing to the instability that allowed ISIS to rise. Moving forward, understanding these dynamics is crucial for preventing the next ISIS-like group from emerging and for bringing long-term stability to the region. So, did the United States create ISIS? The answer isn't as simple as yes or no. It's true that the U.S. played a significant role in shaping the conditions that allowed ISIS to rise. The invasion of Iraq, the power vacuum it created, the dismantling of Saddam Hussein's regime, and the alienation of Sunni Iraqis all contributed to the environment that allowed ISIS to gain a foothold. But these actions, while crucial, were only part of the larger picture. The situation in the Middle East is deeply complex. The U.S., while undeniably a central player, is only one of many international actors whose actions have influenced the rise of ISIS. Other factors, such as sectarian divisions, regional power struggles, and the involvement of countries like Iran, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, have all contributed to the instability in the region. The Middle East has been a battleground for decades, and the rise of ISIS is just one chapter in a much larger and ongoing story. Furthermore, the U.S. has also been a key player in fighting ISIS, leading the global coalition that successfully defeated the group militarily. However, the paradox remains. The same country whose actions helped create the conditions for ISIS's rise has also been the primary force in its destruction. This contradiction highlights the complexity of the situation and raises important questions about the U.S.'s role in the region. In the end, the creation of ISIS wasn't the result of a single decision or event. It was the product of a series of interconnected actions, mistakes, and geopolitical dynamics. The U.S. certainly played a role, but it's also important to recognize the broader context in which ISIS emerged. Understanding this complexity is crucial for anyone looking to grasp the true nature of the Middle East's ongoing struggles. As we look to the future, the lessons of the past should guide our approach to the region. We need to be mindful of the unintended consequences of military interventions and foreign policies. The rise of ISIS shows us that creating stability is far more complicated than simply removing a dictator or toppling a regime. True peace requires understanding the intricate web of political, religious, and cultural factors that shape the region. In conclusion, while the U.S. may have helped create the conditions for ISIS's rise, the full story is much larger than any one nation's actions. The situation in the Middle East is a complicated and multifaceted issue, and it will require a collective, nuanced approach to achieve lasting peace and stability. If you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of global issues. Share this video with your friends to keep the conversation going, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the U.S. is responsible for the rise of ISIS, or are there other factors at play? Stay tuned for more insights, and remember to click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.